So my friends, it is a pleasure to be able to share the Bima this morning with our Darshan. He is not only very bright, very articulate, and a person with whom I've had any number of wonderful conversations about things religious, cultural, and political, but he also happens to be the father of our bar mitzvah. Pleasure to be able to share the Bima this morning with David Burg.
Thanks to our outstanding sound engineer. It's truly a joy and an honor to serve as your darshan on the occasion of Lewis's bar mitzvah, and most importantly, to share this wonderful simcha with our cherished Adat Ariel community and our dear friends and family, some of whom traveled from remote regions of New Jersey, Massachusetts, North Carolina, and even Sonoma County to be with us today. The last time I gave a bar mitzvah speech was about 43 and a half years ago, and truth be told, at the time I thought it was my last one. In retrospect, I guess that was a bit short-sighted, as this looks to be number 2 of 4, but I'm not complaining. Now, returning just briefly to my own bar mitzvah, and I do recognize that's not today's focus. It happened to take place during Sukkot, and the Torah portion at that time of year is a memorable one. God commands Moses to cut a second set of stone tablets upon which to inscribe the 10 Commandments. Moses, of course, had just broken the first set of tablets in anger when he saw his fellow Jews worshiping the golden calf and thereby rejecting God. Pretty appalling stuff. And the 10 Commandments, of course, are the very core of Torah's ethical laws. Frankly, when it comes to Torah, it doesn't get much richer than that. Now, I volunteered to give the Devar Torah today, sight unseen, with no idea from which portion I'd be gleaning deep divine wisdom. And which Torah portion did my wonderful, loving son Lewis pull? Amor. The part of Leviticus setting out laws for priests. Now let's be clear, we're talking about a priesthood that hasn't actually existed for about 2,000 years, give or take a century. As a result, and I must say quite understandably, my immediate reaction was that this arcane portion had been grossly misnamed. It should not have been called Amor. It should have been called a lot less. But like almost everything else in Torah, and in all of Judaism for that matter, a little scratch beneath the surface reveals Amor's own richness. As I hope to explain today, Amor is significant because it places Judaism squarely into its original historical context, which in turn reveals much of Judaism's core purpose and meaning. Judaism was an utterly radical worldview when it emerged during the second millennium before the Common Era, some 3,000 years ago. At that time and in that place, there was one superpower, Egypt. Egyptian culture dominated the known world of the Mediterranean and Middle East. Now let's think about ancient Egypt for a moment. What's the first thing that comes to mind? The pyramids, of course. And what were those pyramids? They were tombs, huge monuments of death. Not surprisingly, therefore, Egypt's religious manifesto was called the Book of the Dead. In other words, what was important to Egyptians was not this life, but whatever comes after it. To put it bluntly, ancient Egypt was a gigantic death cult. In fact, so was the entire pagan world of the Middle East, in which parents routinely murdered their own children to placate innumerable petty deities. This is the world into which Judaism was born. It was an ugly world, a world of death worship and child sacrifice. From its inception, Judaism railed against this prevailing worldview. God unequivocally announced to the Jewish people in Deuteronomy chapter 30, I set before you today life and good, and death and ill, in that I command you today to love your God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments, his laws, and his regulations, that you may stay alive and become many. Life and death I place before you, blessing and curse. Now choose life. Thus, in stark contrast to the ancient world around them, Jews were specifically commanded by their God not to worship death, but rather to choose life, and through their lives to manifest the transcendent ethical precepts laid down by the Creator of the universe. To the first Jews who had lived as slaves in Egypt, this would have been so revolutionary as to be virtually unfathomable. And here's where another genius of Torah, in passages as seemingly arcane as Amor, comes clearly into focus. It was not sufficient merely to command Jews to reject death worship and to live ethical lives. That would have been too blunt, too stark. Simply put, it wouldn't have worked. If Judaism had simply announced a system of ethical commandments and left it there, it almost certainly would have died out ages ago, like every other religious system of the ancient world. Instead, although the primary message of Judaism is that God placed all of us in this world to lead ethical, productive lives, Torah created a parallel system to facilitate that fundamental moral goal. This second pillar of Judaism is what we call holiness, a system of behavioral rituals symbolizing the distinction between the divine and the profane, and most importantly, between life and death, to help teach people how to incorporate God's ethical mandate into their lives. Torah believes that as people behaviorally elevate themselves through these holy rituals, it becomes more natural for them to lead ethical lives. In this way, Torah views holiness as necessary for ethics. Leviticus is primarily a book about holiness. Some of these holy rituals were intended to be practiced by all Jews. Others were to be modeled for the Jewish community by a small, hereditary group of priests known as Kohanim. These are the laws of Amor, a set of holiness rituals for the Kohanim. And once again, at the very center of Amor is the separation between life and death. In the first verses of Amor, Leviticus chapter 21, verses 1 to 4, priests are absolutely prohibited not only from officiating at funerals, but from, quote, defiling themselves merely by attending the funeral of any person other than a member of the priest's immediate family. This stark, symbolic separation between life and death would not have been lost upon early Jews. They lived in a world in which the primary function of priests was exactly the opposite, to preside at funerals. Here's how Professor Bergman described the ancient Egyptian priesthood of that era in the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament. Quote, special priests were involved in the funerary cult. From the New Kingdom on, in other words, from about 1500 BCE, temple priests were often appointed contractually as funerary priests. In the same period, there appeared the water pourers, a new professional funerary priesthood. They cared for the mummies and tombs. So, although arcane to we modern sophisticates, this law of Amor prohibiting Jewish priests from merely being in the presence of a corpse would have been truly astonishing in its day. Indeed, Professor Milgram aptly describes these verses as a, quote, polemic, meaning a strong attack or invective against the Egyptian cult, which was obsessed with death and the afterlife. Certainly, that's how our ancient forebears would have understood it. So Judaism entered the world 3 millennia ago as a revolutionary polemic against the death cults of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, and Amor represents its essence, a set of holiness rituals aimed at behaviorally modeling God's fundamental requirement that Jews choose life over death in order to live out God's ethical laws and create a more righteous society in this world. Ironically, it's only because Judaism, against all odds and in contrast to every other religious system of its time, survived, flourished, and ultimately succeeded, including through Christianity, that these ancient laws of Leviticus seem so distant and so arcane to us today. Yet the message of Torah remains as critical now as ever before. During the last century, humanity experienced more death and destruction, more wanton cruelty than ever before in human history. And today we share this planet with tens of millions of adherents who believe Allah applauds their murder of infidels and rewards their cruelty with sexual gifts in the afterlife. Yes, friends, we do still have death cults. So 3,000 years after its inception, the world continues to need Judaism. And even if many of us don't observe all of its holiness rituals, the most important thing we can do as Jews is to inculcate our children with strong Jewish values and Jewish identity. Therefore, it's with overwhelming love, pride, and satisfaction that we today welcome Louis into the Jewish community as an independent Jew, a young man in your own right, and I look forward to doing the same for Daniel and Elliot in the not-too-distant future. I ask each of the 3 of you to take Judaism seriously in your own chosen ways, but most importantly, to pass along clear Jewish values and identity to your own children, and to ask them to do the same for their children as I am asking you today. It is the single most important contribution each of you can make toward a better world. Once again, thanks so much to all of you for being here today. For those who are new to Adat Ariel, we wholeheartedly welcome you, and we look forward to celebrating Louis's bar mitzvah with each of you during our Kiddush lunch immediately following the service. Shabbat Shalom.